If you look at the history of modern warfare, the story is dominated by massive scale, industrial power, and unimaginable complexity. We think of battlefields mapped out by satellite GPS, giant steel tanks rumbling across deserts, fighter jets executing hypersonic maneuvers in the clouds, and computerized command centers coordinating millions of soldiers in real time. We treat military victory as a solved equation of industrial output, technological superiority, and economic raw power. But if you strip away the modern technology, the steel, and the gunpowder, and trace the concept of human conflict all the way back to its very origin, you will find a deeply unsettling truth. Long before the first bronze sword was cast, before the first shield was woven, and before anyone had ever written down a single strategy, ancient humans were already master military tacticians. Physically, we are slow, soft, weak, and completely lack natural fangs or claws. On paper, we should have been a non-threat in any physical confrontation. Yet early humans didn't just survive the constant threat of intertribal warfare. They engineered some of the most successful, most lethal, and most sophisticated combat strategies in the history of life on this planet. They did it with no standing armies, no steel armor, and no military academies. So, how did ancient humans actually win their wars? What were their secret tactical weapons? And how did our ancestors turn the brutal math of prehistoric combat into a masterclass of evolutionary survival? To find the answer, we first have to dismantle one of the most comfortable, highly romanticized myths of the modern world, the myth of the peaceful savage. For decades, it was popular to believe that prehistoric hunter-gatherers lived in a state of absolute, untouched harmony with nature and each other. We pictured a world where resource disputes were resolved with simple shouting matches, where territory was shared freely, and where physical violence was a rare, modern corruption of our otherwise peaceful nature. It is a beautiful, comforting story, but the archaeological record has completely shattered this illusion, and the evidence is written directly in the bones of our ancestors. At a site in Sudan, known as Cemetery 117, or Jebel Sahaba, archaeologists excavated the remains of dozens of humans who lived over 13,000 years ago. More than half of those skeletons, including women and young children, showed signs of violent death. Sharp stone spear points embedded in their ribs, deep defensive fractures on their forearms, and skulls crushed by heavy wooden clubs. At another site in Kenya called Nadaruk, scientists uncovered the 10,000-year-old remains of a hunter-gatherer group who had been systematically massacred, their hands bound, their skulls smashed by blunt instruments, and their bodies left unburied in the mud. Prehistoric warfare was not a peaceful misunderstanding. It was constant, lethal, asymmetrical, and highly coordinated. Our ancestors did not just occasionally fight, they were deeply biologically organized for conflict. But if prehistoric warfare was so common, how did a tribe actually win? In a world where everyone had access to the same basic wood, stone, and bone materials, you couldn't just outproduce your enemy in a factory. You couldn't buy better steel or build bigger ships. This meant that the first most powerful weapon in the history of human warfare was not a physical tool. It was the social network. As we established earlier in our evolutionary journey, our closest living primate relatives are locked into small, highly competitive social groups. A chimpanzee troop is intensely territorial, and males will frequently execute coordinated border patrols to find, ambush, and kill isolated members of neighboring troops. Biologists call this coalitionary killing. It is the biological root of human warfare. But chimpanzees are limited by their brains. They can only maintain social bonds with about 50 individuals. Once a group gets larger than that, it naturally splits apart, and the two factions become enemies. But Homo sapiens developed a unique biological cheat code: complex, recursive language. This allowed us to build shared myths, stories, and tribal alliances that united complete strangers. Sapiens could easily maintain cooperative social networks of up to 150 people. When a conflict broke out, this social network was our ultimate military advantage. If a small isolated group of 20 Neanderthals or a rival human family came into conflict with a sapiens camp, they weren't just facing the local family. Sapiens used their complex language networks to call in reinforcement bands from neighboring valleys. Within days, a massive coordinated allied force of 50 or 60 fully armed hunters would assemble at a prearranged point. To the isolated group, it was a terrifying, unwinnable math equation. Sapiens won the first wars because we invented the concept of the military alliance. We turned the scattered, isolated family units of our competitors into an organized coalition that could easily surround, overwhelm, and outnumber any opponent. The second secret to prehistoric victory was how our ancestors treated the battlefield itself. We tend to view military history through the lens of great cinematic pitched battles. We picture two massive armies lining up on a flat, grassy field, blowing war horns, and charging directly into each other in a glorious head-on clash of steel and courage. It makes for incredible cinema, but in the real prehistoric world of raw survival, a head-on pitched battle was a sign of complete tactical failure. Prehistoric warfare was almost exclusively built on guerrilla tactics, stealth, and asymmetry. The most highly optimized, highly successful military maneuver in human history was the dawn raid. In hunter-gatherer combat, you did not want a fair fight. You wanted to attack when the enemy was at their absolute weakest, and that meant attacking while they slept. A war party of 20 hunters would silently surround a rival campsite in the pitch dark of the early morning, hiding behind trees and rocks, waiting for the campfire to die down to its last embers. Then, right at the break of dawn, when sleep was deepest and visibility was lowest, they would launch a sudden, devastating, highly coordinated ambush. They would strike the shelters, use heavy wooden clubs to disable the sleeping warriors before they could even reach for their weapons, and secure the territory in minutes with almost zero physical risk to their own hunters. It was a cold, ruthless, and incredibly efficient strategy. Our ancestors won wars by ensuring that the enemy never even got a chance to fight back. But when stealth failed, and they did have to fight in the open, ancient humans relied on their next massive advantage: ballistic range. Physically, humans are slow runners and terrible sprinters, but our upper bodies are uniquely, beautifully designed for throwing. No other primate can throw a projectile with any real speed or accuracy because their shoulder joints are designed for hanging and climbing. But the human shoulder has a relaxed, low-sitting joint that behaves like a high-speed slingshot, allowing us to launch projectiles with immense force. And we spent thousands of generations weaponizing this throwing ability. Before we had metal armor, the side that could kill from the furthest distance was the side that won. Neanderthals, as we know, relied on heavy, close-range wooden thrusting spears. This required them to get within arm's reach of a giant woolly mammoth or an enemy warrior, putting their bodies in extreme danger. But Homo sapiens invented the atlatl, or spear thrower. The atlatl is a simple wooden lever that hooks onto the back of a lightweight spear dart, effectively extending the length of the human arm. This simple mechanical lever allowed a human hunter to launch a spear at over 90 miles an hour, hitting a target with lethal force from a safe distance of 100 feet. We also utilized the sling, a simple leather strap used to launch smooth river stones at bullet-like speeds of up to 150 miles an hour. To an enemy warrior, armed only with a handheld club or a heavy thrusting spear, facing a line of sapiens, hunters was like walking into a firing squad. Our ancestors could rain down a constant lethal storm of high-speed stone projectiles from complete safety. They won victories because they realized that the best way to survive close-quarters combat was to ensure that the enemy never got close enough to touch them. But our ballistic weapons only worked in the light of day. To prevent the devastating dawn raids we talked about earlier, and to hunt down fleeing enemies, humans relied on their most ingenious military asset, an interspecies partnership. Around 30,000 years ago, humans domesticated the wolf, creating the world's very first guard dogs. This alliance completely transformed the security of the prehistoric campsite. Wolves possessed the sensory superpowers that humans completely lacked. A resting human camp is biologically deaf and blind in the dark. But a pack of loyal gray wolves guarding the perimeter could smell an approaching enemy war party from miles away and hear the silent, soft footsteps of a scout creeping through the grass in the pitch dark. By allying with wolves, our camps became virtually immune to the threat of the sudden dawn raid. The moment an enemy approached, the wolves would bark loudly, firing an instant, tribe-wide alarm that woke the sleeping warriors to full alertness in seconds. The enemy's element of surprise was instantly destroyed, turning their carefully planned ambush into a deadly trap. And during the battle, the wolves acted as highly coordinated tactical assets, chasing down fleeing enemies, tracking wounded targets through the thick forest, and creating chaos on the battlefield. We won our wars because we didn't just fight as a human tribe, we fought as an allied interspecies pack. And while weapons and tactics won individual battles, the slower, deeper killer in any war was logistics. In the ancient world, you could not march a war party across a mountain range if you had nothing to eat. If your warriors had to stop every few hours to gather berries, hunt rabbits, or grind grains, your military mobility was completely crippled. You couldn't chase a fleeing enemy, you couldn't execute a long flank, and you couldn't sustain a long-term siege. The side that could stay fed on the march was the side that won the campaign, and early humans solved this with high-density survival food, most notably pemmican, made by pounding lean dried meat into a fine powder, mixing it with rendered animal fat, and stirring in dried wild berries. Pemmican was a biological wonder. It was packed with extreme calorie density, incredibly lightweight, and because the fat sealed the meat from moisture and air, it could keep fresh for years without rotting. A warrior could pack enough pemmican in a small leather pouch to feed themselves for a month. Sapiens war parties could travel hundreds of miles across freezing glaciers, barren steppes, and burning deserts, staying fully fed, energized, and mobile, while their enemies starved, grew weak, and were forced to disperse to find food. We won the long campaigns because we turned our food into a lightweight, stable, high-energy fuel that let us outmarch every other species on the planet. Finally, there was the immense power of psychological warfare and symbolic communication. In a raw, chaotic, prehistoric battle, coordination was everything. If your warriors couldn't communicate, your attack would quickly fall apart into a disorganized mess. But Homo sapiens used their complex, symbolic language to execute highly sophisticated, multi-pronged tactical maneuvers in real time. We could coordinate a pincer movement, signal a feigned retreat to draw the enemy out of their defenses, or arrange a simultaneous flank from two different directions. And we didn't just communicate, we actively terrified our opponents. Before a raid, warriors would cover their faces and bodies in bright red ochre paint, mimicking the look of blood, death, and supernatural spirits. They would wear the heavy furs of cave bears, or the skulls of wolves, transforming themselves visually from simple human figures into towering, terrifying monsters of the forest. They would use simple clay horns or hollow wooden tubes to produce deep, booming, unnatural war cries that echoed through the dark valleys, shattering the enemy's psychological resolve before a single spear was ever thrown. We cast a deep, terrifying psychological shadow over the prehistoric world. We won our wars because we didn't just attack the enemy's physical bodies. We attacked their minds, using fear, paint, and sound to break their courage before the physical battle even began. We tend to look back at our ancient ancestors and view them as primitive, simple creatures who stumbled through history with no real planning, understanding, or strategic thought. But the reality is that the blueprint of modern military strategy was entirely written in the dirt of the Pleistocene. Every major tactical concept we use today, from the long-distance ballistic strike and the early warning radar system to the elite small unit raid and the psychological terror campaign, was pioneered by hairless, tropical apes trying to survive a brutal, highly competitive world. They did not win their victories because they were physically superior. They won because they stood together by the campfire, built massive cooperative networks of trust, allied with the wolves, and engineered weapons that bridged the gap of distance. We're the last human species standing on this planet, not by accident, but because our ancestors were the ultimate cooperative tacticians, a species built to connect, to plan, and to win, carrying our shared stories across every horizon we conquered.